You can see him from his head cam, he's going left, he's going right.
That sort of mind game's going on.
If rounds aren't at your feet, you're really actually not that bothered.
Andrew, thanks very much. Welcome back. You are a former major in 3 Para, Parachute Regiment, and did 3 tours of Afghanistan, very experienced soldier, and now you're a academic researcher, and you've been to Ukraine several times, right up to the frontline area, to Bryansk, so you've got a good knowledge of how they're fighting. I just wanted to talk to you about the infantry tactics that we're seeing there particularly. What actually works, not so much the theory, and what you've seen, what surprised you, what's really interested you about the way they're fighting. Obviously, they're learning a lot of this from being trained by the Brits, for instance, or on Interflex or other things. So some of it is our own way of fighting. But this is some footage to show is Ukrainian troops around Toretsk doing. There's Russians inside the cellars of the basements of these buildings that they're trying to get out. A hugely difficult thing to do, I imagine, to actually safely remove them, because you don't know how many there are, what they've got, etc. But just in terms of the British infantry training, emphasises SOPs and doctrine, the way they fight. How important is really just improvisation as they're going through scenarios like this?
Well, you need to be able to improvise, but within, whilst maintaining the basic stuff that you've been taught. And I think this is a great example of how challenging this is to operate in. Because look, you've got rubble, you've got trees, you've got buildings that have come down. There's obviously a basement threat they're talking about, so there's an underground threat as well. And then when you get to this urban environment, of course, you've got the high features. And then on top of that, you've got enemy drones that might well be coming in to help their guys. So you need to be able to stay flexible, but you also need to make sure you are doing your skills and drills properly. And you can see this here, he's keeping his arcs covered. You can see even from his head cam, he's going left, he's going right. He's not getting fixated on the target. He's keeping his situational awareness. Yeah. And then we're into the rooms here. You can see they're covering all the arcs. But it's really difficult because it's hard to mass troops on the front lines of Ukraine. If you have battalions going forward, they get wiped out. And so what we're seeing here is small squads going forward. But then that makes it really difficult. So you hear that they're calling clear there. Now they move to the next building. Who keeps that building clear?
Right.
You have to make sure you've killed everyone and nobody can get in then behind you.
Because
so really tricky.
You would have done that similar thing in compounds in Afghan, but you would have been, I guess, you wouldn't have had a drone threat, and you would have been far more wary of IEDs inside walls or elsewhere that would have hurt your guys. So it's different in that respect, isn't it? I mean, to do this with drones above you changes it somewhat. Yeah,
well, for them the IEDs are flying.
Yeah, okay.
That's the big difference here, and are hunting you with somebody controlling it at the other end.
Yeah. So
that's the big challenge. But I mean, if you just go back sort of 5-10 seconds, you can see the absolute basics are still being applied. So when he goes to cross the open ground,
is this where they're stacking up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a stack there. That's the sort of drills we'd expect to see as we do it.
But I don't know what's in these buildings.
No, and two guys just to clear that building is a big ask, actually.
Okay.
Urban warfare of that nature is famous for sucking up huge amounts of manpower. Like we go 3-1 in the assault, in the open 5-1 at least for urban, because we know you're going to take bigger casualties, and then you have to hold stuff as well. So there you go. He's covering, and then his mates are moving around to the right there. So that's absolutely classic. That's a great example of how the basics apply in all situations. You don't move without someone covering you. So it's about adaptation, but it's about adaptation whilst doing the basics well.
Because I thought that was terrible. He's going down there. I mean, it doesn't know what's down there. I think there are a couple of Russians in a basement nearby that they've identified already.
I mean, you'd be tempted to grenade that.
I think they do eventually. Eventually, it comes to that situation. But I mean, how quickly have you seen them learn to do this well?
I think, like every conflict, they started off rusty and got much better as they went along in every aspect. Because I think that's every war ever. It doesn't matter which army you are. I'm sure we were much better at the end of Afghanistan in doing certain things than we were when we first went in, because it's never quite like training. There's always differences. And you do a section or a platoon attack at Brecon where you've got a fire support section, and you've got your manoeuvring section, then you've got your reserve. And actually in Afghanistan that applied, but it was a lot more chaotic and a lot more fluid. And it's about learning how to take what you know from training and then adapt it to doing it on the ground and then getting good at it.
In terms of the junior leadership that we've seen, I've been to Interflex and we've filmed the NCO's training. Are they good from what you've seen?
I mean, the ones I've seen have been, it's incredibly challenging to command and control in that situation. And I think that's the key point here, is that what we've seen throughout this video is the constant communication.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're talking backwards and forwards all the way through. And really, rather than, you know, having the section commander running the whole thing on strings like puppets, his troops have got that ability to coordinate between themselves, pass the messages backwards and forwards because they know what needs to be done. And that's a really good sign of very experienced troops. And if you were new in combat and you'd never done that before, the NCOs need to be a lot more all over it. Once you're a hardened, battle-hardened squad or a section, that becomes a lot more natural, and the NCO can then take a step back.
This is the International Legion, which may well not be anymore, but he's having some problems here with his RPG to get it to fire. This is very chaotic stuff inside the forest. I think this is Cremina again, up near Lyman. But just, I mean, what's it like? You've been in firefights, I'm sure, many of them. What's that like?
So the adrenaline is probably the first part, and then the focus on your job is the second part. I think those are the two things that really, really jump out in my memory of just what a buzz it was. And you very quickly learn the difference between effective enemy fire and just rounds flying around. They make a very different sound.
Okay.
And you learn, I think, when you've got the freedom to move and when you haven't. So that was a really interesting kind of learning curve for me, because first time I was just, in the dirt, digging with my eyelids, going, okay, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah.
I looked across and saw a colour sergeant was doing the same, so I was happy that I got it right. But eventually you learn that you can manoeuvre when the enemy are firing. You learn that there is, when there's a weight of fire coming from your guys, actually it does give you the freedom to go left or right flanking. And it's about learning when that is, and again, you just get better at it as you go on, to the point where at the end of a tour, if rounds aren't at your feet, you're really actually not that bothered. So yeah, it's a really interesting experience.
So this is obviously more urban, inside a building. Is that good, what you're seeing there?
I mean, I think the better way to think of this is more like an open field.
Right.
Because that's a big, huge expanse of building. And the only cover they've got is these big pillars that are in between. So you've got to find a way to get from one to the other and get to the other side. And it's all about being creative in this situation, but creative, again, within the bounds of what you've been taught.
Yeah.
And so you can see that one person's covering and then the next guy bounds to the next column and so forth. And it's just a really good adaptation of just standard drills. And then, of course, we're now into the corridors, and this shows it. I think that showed it really well, because you've gone from light into dark. All of a sudden, your eyesight's having to adjust, and it's just a really tricky environment.
I mean, these are the legions. Some of these guys will have been ex-US Marines or whatever before, I'm guessing, so they will have some idea of what's going on. I mean, in terms of the sort of tactical habits you developed in Afghanistan, you said by the end of it it was kind of second knowledge to you what you should be doing.
Yeah, so you think about 5s and 20s. So every time you stop, you check 5 meters closely,
right,
and then you scan out to 20 meters. You'd find in training people would just forget all the time. You'd be going through Sandhurst, and colour sergeant would always be going, I can't do 5s and 20s. By the end of a tour in Afghan, that is just second nature, to the point where it's really hard to switch off when you get home and you're walking down the high street and you find yourself doing 5s and 20s all the time. It becomes that ingrained in you. And it's the same when it comes to things like this, when they're crossing open ground or where they're doing their stacking drills. Like, when you've done it enough times, it just becomes second nature. But the key then is to make sure that you don't become sloppy with it. So you keep on top of the standards, and that's probably the hardest thing to do.
I mean, in terms of, what have been some of the most interesting tactical things you've seen? I heard the other day, for instance, that the Ukrainians are vacating certain parts of trenches, for instance, to allow the Russians in, knowing full well they will come in and inhabit those, and then obviously hitting them afterwards. Is that sort of mind games going on?
Yeah, so
tactical stuff?
The current doctrine's recommending like 50% of defensive positions you make are deception.
Right.
So they're not occupied. They're there just to trick the enemy into coming in there, and then you can, you'll have that DF'd, and you can then hit it. So 50% deception is a really big deal. But I think the really surprising thing for me is just the constant evolution. So to get to the front, they put up drone nets. so the FPV drones couldn't get in.
Yeah.
And so what the Russians started then doing was dropping thermite onto the nets to burn them up so they could get through.
Yeah.
And you've just got this constant cat and mouse evolution going on. And I saw a great piece the other day which suggested that essentially you need to control your drone teams like a tech startup, where they have the freedom to innovate and they have the freedom to be creative, and the freedom to make new things to get around, because the pace of change is so big at the moment that if you have like a formal staffed up lessons learned process, it just takes too long. So it's, again, there's a lot of trust needed, there's a lot of empowerment needed for your troops, and that's probably a really good lesson for commanders. I'm
also intrigued whether Ukrainian troops are coming, they're briefing British command, if you like, about what they are seeing and how they're fighting. Is there any to and fro there, do you think, that we maybe don't see, obviously, but as we mentioned, the way they set their ops rooms up, for instance, that looks exactly like those ops rooms.
Exactly like ours. And they've clearly taken a lot from Interflex and a lot from the training. But there will, of course, always come a tipping point where actually, the master has become the student almost. And we're going to have to go to them and say, hey, can you show us how you did X, Y, Z? Because we are way behind them in terms of stuff like procurement, in terms of counter-fires, that sort of thing. And yeah, we'd be insane not to speak to our friends and learn the lessons that they learned the hard way. And
what are the Ukrainians doing tactically to keep themselves alive that seems to work, to keep their attrition rate down? They're obviously not doing the meat grinder assaults that the Russians are doing. But that in itself is difficult to fight against because it is a constant...
Yeah, just a constant wave coming at you. So first of all, they're replacing what humans they can with automation. So especially in things like Kazovac and fire support, we've seen the drones that they're using for those. Secondly is the use of their cover. So, they're dispersing their troops. They're not using the big trenches anymore. They're using strong points that are armed with, 4 to 6 guys, no more than that.
Right.
And those troops live constantly underground. The automation of the eyeball, the drones are now the eyeballs of these troops, and they're only called out from the cover when they're told they're needed, whilst then striking that balance in the weather when the drones can't fly. And then there's also the explosion of countermeasures that you're seeing. Like every single vehicle has got ECM on it. Yeah. And then there's always that electronic fight with the Russians to try and maintain the supremacy in that electronic space.
Let's have a look at some of the Russians, because I've got some video here of a Russian dismount here, which looks very chaotic. But that might just be the thing of the battle. But their kind of way of fighting, how have they also evolved tactically, do you think?
Well, they've had to respond to the Ukrainian drone threat. So, they don't move at night. They don't move in the daytime. They only move at night.
Right.
You're seeing on the tanks here these sheeting, the anti-drone netting. Of course, they've captured that adaptation as well. But the Russians aren't doing the meat waves in the way they were. They are using these small teams of 4 to 5 troops who are guided in by drone. They hide behind and they try and create the opportunity for then the follow-on troops to come behind them, in a Ukrainian seam or a Ukrainian rear area. And the Russians have adapted less well than the Ukrainians because they still have the mass, they still have the numbers over the Ukrainians, and they're quite happy to waste human life in an almost cavalier way. I mean, 1.1 million casualties is the higher estimate right now. So yeah, they've got the luxury of mass, the luxury of not caring about their troops, whereas the Ukrainians don't have that, and that does give the Russians an upper hand.
Yeah, I mean, when you were training, you were a trainee soldier, because we were in the counterinsurgency phase, so you were probably, you're not a Cold War warrior effectively. But we learned about the Russian army at that point as being a fairly competent outfit. It has improved dramatically during this war, though, I think, from where they were. The sort of disaster of Hostomel to where they are now, even with the meat wave aspect of things, they have got better.
Yeah, but they've got better in certain ways. One of them is how they're using the glide bombs.
Yeah.
They don't keep the aircraft on station. They keep them at standoff. They drop these bombs that have, that are able to glide in from very long distance, and that's causing real hits. What I don't think they've done particularly well is gotten any better at the basic soldiering level. Less those small units who sort of snurgle in to try and get in behind the Ukrainian lines. What we're seeing from those waves going forward is actually really poor quality, and that's why they're taking the huge casualties there. because they just don't seem to care about losing their troops. And that's almost a combat multiplier in some ways.
And I know I'll keep asking the same question again, but it's just in terms of the tactical lessons from this for the British Army, for Western militaries, what will they be taking away from this?
I mean, stuff like this is the use of fires, I think, is what we're seeing, is how you actually get people onto those positions so you can assault them. And drones are all very well, but they're badly affected by weather. So what you do need is your artillery. So you need to find the enemy. You need to use the artillery to hit them, so that you can actually get your armoured vehicles onto the position, and then you need the infantry to get into the trenches and the strong points and the buildings in order to do that last bound clearance. And a key lesson is that you can have all the tech in the world, all the drones in the world, and all the fires in the world, but you still need the infantrymen to get in there and finish the job.
So some of this isn't revolutionary, really, in terms of tactical stuff. It's just the application, and the drone thing does change a lot of it.
It's new ways of doing old things
Yeah.
that we've always tried to do: find, fix, strike, and exploit as the phases of the way through we go through these assaults. We're still finding people, but with drones. We're still fixing people, but with drones. And we're still striking people, but with drones. But you can't complete that without the basic Tommy.
Yeah. In terms of the evolution speed, that's the other thing. I mean, compare that to how things evolved in Afghanistan, which they did tactically, the way you were doing things. But the speed at which they're evolving and changing stuff is quite phenomenal.
Yeah, and the low cost as well. If we look at how cheap some of these drones, like the Mavics, you can get them for $2,000. This is really, really cheap, especially when you think about it in frame of military procurement, which can often run into the billions for an armoured platform.
Yeah.
When you can change this quickly and this cheaply, and be this effective at scale, I think there are some really big questions to ask about how the British Army does its procurement, because we can't afford to keep spending billions on boutique, exquisite equipment, when actually what we need is masses of cheap stuff, but just large numbers of it, and be really good at using it. But we have to take the right lessons. So it's about finding that balance between the high-end kit and the low-end kit, and making sure it's all properly resourced. Andrew,
thanks very much for joining us. That was fascinating insight. Next time we're going to talk about the human cost of the war in Ukraine, and particularly, obviously, your experience as a commander of men in Afghanistan, what that was like. And if you've enjoyed my conversation with Andrew, then please watch us and like and subscribe to our Forces News YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. For more from BFBS Forces News, like and subscribe to our channel.